In 2004, a construction crew broke ground in a quiet neighborhood on the European side of Istanbul. They were building a train station. The Marmaray project, a rail tunnel that would run beneath the Bosphorus and connect Europe to Asia. The most ambitious infrastructure project in Turkey's history. Engineers had planned for minor delays. Istanbul is an old city. They knew that. What they hit was not minor. Within the first days of digging, workers began pulling up fragments of wood, old wood, waterlogged, darkened, preserved in the wet clay like something the earth had been holding for safekeeping. The archaeologist on site took one look and stopped everything. It wasn't a timber. It was a ship. Then they found another. Then another. The heavy machinery went quiet. Under Turkish law, once significant archaeological remains are identified, the site transfers immediately to museum authority. Mechanical tools stop. Workers with shovels replace the excavators. The engineers looked at their timeline and said nothing. The dig had just changed. Here's the thing about Istanbul. The city has been continuously inhabited for at least 2,500 years. Layer upon layer upon layer, Ottoman over Byzantine, Byzantine over Roman, Roman over Greek. Every major excavation in the historic peninsula expects to find something. The project had built in a buffer. A few weeks, maybe a month. What they uncovered would take 9 years. The first layer was the harbor. Not just any harbor. The harbor of Theodosius, the largest commercial port in Constantinople during the early Byzantine Empire. Built in the 4th century under Emperor Theodosius I, for 700 years, it was the economic heart of the Byzantine capital. The point of entry for the grain supply that fed the entire city. Hundreds of ships docked there every year, and then it disappeared. A river called the Lycos drained from the hills above the city into the harbor basin. Over centuries, the sediment it carried began to fill the harbor from the inside out. By the 11th century, only small boats could navigate the shallows. By the 15th century, the basin was gone. The river filled it completely. Farmland grew where ships had once anchored. The memory of the harbor faded from the city's consciousness entirely. By the 20th century, houses had been built on top of it. Nobody knew it was there. The maps showed it in approximately the right area, but its exact location, its dimensions, its depth, all unknown. Until a construction crew with a deadline drove their equipment into the soft earth of the Yenikapı district and broke through into something that had been sealed for 600 years. Think about that. A harbor, the economic engine of an empire, buried under a neighborhood, and no one in that neighborhood knew it was beneath them. The excavation covered more than 58,000 square meters. The deposit was 12 meters deep. Between 2004 and 2013, this became one of the largest archaeological excavations ever conducted in Europe. Over 100,000 artifacts were recovered: pottery, coins, leather sandals, bronze mirrors, ivory game pieces, glass vessels, oil lamps, wooden spoons, perfume bottles, the bones of camels, horses, bears, ostriches, elephants, lions, dolphins, the skulls of criminals, their severed heads, tossed into the harbor waters in some long-forgotten act of justice or punishment. Some of those objects were mundane: a key, a comb, a child's gaming piece carved from ivory, worn smooth at the edges from use. Objects that belonged to someone's ordinary day, a day that ended, and the object stayed behind, and the harbor swallowed it. And here it was, 12 centuries later, in a plastic tray under fluorescent lights. Most of them will never be displayed. There isn't space. The museum that was supposed to hold them hasn't been built yet. They sit in storage, cataloged and preserved, waiting, all of it sealed in mud. preserved by the same waterlogged conditions that had hidden the harbor from the modern world. But the artifacts weren't the discovery. The ships were, 37 of them, shipwrecks dating from the 5th to the 11th century, buried in the harbor sediment where they had sunk, one on top of another, over the course of 700 years. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, coastal transports, and rare military galleys with oar ports still visible in the hull planking. No single excavation had ever produced this many ancient shipwrecks. Underwater archaeologists had spent decades recovering individual vessels from the Mediterranean seabed, one at a time, at enormous cost. Here, in the mud beneath an Istanbul neighborhood, 37 ships emerged from a single dig, their timbers still intact, their construction still legible. One vessel contained a small wooden box with a folding lid, a writing tablet that still opened. Another ship carried amphorae filled with grape seeds, evidence of the wine trade that had sustained the Byzantine economy. A wooden pier, its stakes still driven into the seabed, stretched over 43 meters, marking the exact spot where ships had loaded and unloaded for centuries. The ships had likely sunk during storms. The harbor authorities never recovered them. They simply settled into the silt, one on top of another, as the harbor floor slowly rose. And eventually, the Lycos River finished its work, and the harbor was gone, and the ships were gone with it, sealed under 6 centuries of city. 37 ships. In the same harbor where they sank. Most people assume that what we don't know about the ancient world is because the evidence was destroyed. Fire, war, time. But sometimes the evidence isn't gone. It's just buried. And this is where things change. Because beneath the harbor floor, beneath the ships, beneath the Byzantine layers, the excavation kept going. And at a depth of more than 6 meters below modern sea level, the dig reached something that had nothing to do with Constantinople, something much older. A Neolithic settlement, dating to approximately 6,500 BCE. Before that number means anything, consider what it sits next to. The Byzantine harbor was built in the 4th century. The Roman city before it, older still. The Greek settlement of Byzantium, older than that. Historians had traced human presence on this peninsula back roughly 2,500 years, with confidence, and a little further with caution. 6,500 BCE is not a little further. It is 4,000 years before Troy, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid. It is so far back that the sea itself was a different shape. The oldest known evidence of human habitation in Istanbul. It pushed the city's documented history back by 2,500 years. Not a small correction. Not a minor update to the timeline. A rewrite. The settlement had been built on the shore of the Sea of Marmara when the sea was still a freshwater lake. Smaller, lower, shaped differently than it is today. Rising sea levels after the last ice age eventually submerged the site, sealing it beneath marine sediment. Then, thousands of years later, the harbor was built on top of it. Then, the harbor silted up. Then the neighborhood was built. Then, the train station came. Layer over layer over layer. At the edge of a small swamp beside the shore, people had built their homes. Circular and rectangular houses with wooden posts driven into the ground. Walls made of wattle and daub. Some of the wooden structural elements were preserved in the waterlogged clay, an extraordinary rarity for Neolithic sites anywhere in the world, where organic material almost never survives. Inside and around the houses, pottery, stone tools, flint blades, arrowheads, a carnelian seal, graves with skeletons curled in the fetal position, a burial practice common across Neolithic Anatolia. And then something no one had seen before in this region. 7 cremation burials, a type of burial practice that had been entirely unknown in Anatolian Neolithic contexts until this moment. Not rare, unknown. It forced researchers to reconsider what they thought they knew about the funerary practices of the region's earliest inhabitants. That's the part that doesn't make headlines, but matters most. Not just that the site was old, that it was wrong in specific ways. The cremation burials didn't fit the model. The footprints didn't fit the model. The preservation of organic material, wood, rope, grain at that depth, in those conditions, didn't fit the model. Every time a site rewrites what was known, it also rewrites what was assumed about everything adjacent to it. Other sites, other timelines, other conclusions drawn from incomplete evidence. The Yenikapı excavation didn't just add data, it changed the shape of the questions. That's what 9 years under a train station produced. But that wasn't the deepest layer. In the soft sediment around the structures, in the mud beside the Marmaray shore, the archaeologists found something no one had expected. Footprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the mud 8,500 years ago. The first such examples ever found in Anatolian archaeology. Adults and children had walked through the settlement, their feet sinking into the wet ground beside the shore. The impressions hardened, the sea rose, the swamp was buried, the harbor was built on top, the ships sank, the silt filled in, the houses came, the street came, the station came. For 8,500 years, those footprints waited. Someone walked here. A child, maybe, bare feet in wet mud, walking toward the water. And whatever they were walking toward, we'll never know. But the impression of that walk survived. It survived the rising sea, the collapsing settlement, the harbor that buried it, the 37 ships that sank above it, the 6 centuries of city built on top of all of it. It survived everything. The Marmaray project was originally scheduled to open in 2009. It opened in 2013, 4 years late. Delayed almost entirely by what was under the ground. The Turkish government, which had championed the project as a symbol of modern Turkey's ambition, publicly expressed frustration at the delays. The tension between the archaeologists and the engineers was constant. The archaeologists needed decades. The engineers needed the site cleared. Turkish law sided with the archaeologists. In the end, the artifacts were removed. The ships were extracted over 8 years, each one lifted from the mud with painstaking care. Their waterlogged timbers kept constantly moist to prevent collapse. The 100,000 artifacts were transferred to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Plans were drawn for a dedicated museum and archaeological park at the Yenikapı site. And the Marmaray Tunnel opened. Trains now run beneath the Bosphorus, connecting Europe to Asia, carrying over 1 million passengers a day. They pass through the same ground that held a Neolithic village, a Byzantine harbor, 37 shipwrecks, and the footprints of people who lived there before the sea rose and swallowed everything. The Yenikapı station was not the only discovery. At another station on the European side, workers uncovered the remains of the city's oldest harbor, the one that existed before Constantinople was even founded, when the city was still called Byzantium. On the Asian side, excavations revealed a Byzantine church surrounded by 97 skeletons, 3 stations, 2 continents, 8,500 years of continuous human occupation cut open by a single infrastructure project. They were building a train station. What they built instead was a cross-section of 8,500 years of civilization, cut 12 meters deep into the earth, beneath one of the oldest cities on the planet. The trains are running now. 1 million people a day move through that station. Beneath them, sealed in climate-controlled storage, waiting for a museum that hasn't been built yet, are the ships, the footprints, the graves, the writing tablet that still opens, the grape seeds from a wine trade that ended 1,000 years ago. And somewhere under the city, deeper than the station reached, there are almost certainly more layers. There always are. The ground kept the secret for 8,500 years. It's only just started talking.